The flak tore through us, and smoke filled the fuselage while the orders said, "Hold formation." I left the ball turret and crawled into the fire, knowing the cables above me carried our only control. My superiors would read the report later. I could hear the engine failing now. Inside that burning aircraft, survival felt narrower than the turret I had just left. In the spring of 1943, the Allied air campaign over Western Europe had entered a demanding phase. From airfields across eastern England, heavy bombers of the United States Army Air Forces departed almost daily toward occupied territory. Their objectives were industrial centers, rail junctions, submarine pens, and aircraft factories that sustained the German war effort. Losses were steady. Long-range fighter escort remained limited, and bomber formations often continued deep into hostile airspace exposed to anti-aircraft fire and intercepting fighters. At RAF Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk, the 100th Bombardment Group, part of the 8th Air Force, prepared for another mission. The base, constructed only months earlier, consisted of concrete runways, perimeter tracks, and dispersed hardstands ringed by flat farmland. Living quarters were functional and recently erected. The men stationed there had grown accustomed to early briefings, long waits on cold dispersal points, and the persistent smell of fuel and oil that clung to flight clothing. Among them was Staff Sergeant Maynard Snuffy Smith, a ball turret gunner assigned to a B-17 Flying Fortress. Born in Michigan and raised during the years of economic hardship that followed the First World War, Smith had enlisted in 1942. He completed aerial gunnery training in the United States before being shipped overseas as part of a replacement crew. His role placed him in the lowest position of the aircraft, inside a cramped, spherical turret mounted beneath the fuselage. From there, he operated twin .50 caliber machine guns, scanning the sky for fighters approaching from below. The ball turret offered exceptional fields of fire but little margin for comfort. Entry required the gunner to curl into the confined space, knees drawn toward his chest with limited room to shift position. Oxygen equipment and heated flight suits were necessary at operational altitudes, where temperatures dropped well below freezing. Once airborne, the gunner depended on the interphone system to receive directions from the aircraft commander and to report enemy movements. By early May 1943, the 8th Air Force had intensified daylight bombing operations against targets in France and Germany. On May 1st, the 100th Bombardment Group was assigned a mission against the submarine base at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. The target was heavily defended. Previous raids had encountered concentrated anti-aircraft fire from coastal batteries and inland positions protecting the harbor installations. The morning briefing at Thorpe Abbotts followed established procedure. Crews gathered in a secured room where curtains were drawn over large wall maps. Intelligence officers outlined the route across the English Channel, the expected flak concentrations, and known fighter activity. Weather reports were delivered with caution. Cloud cover over the target area appeared variable. The group would join other formations assembling over England before proceeding south. Smith's aircraft commander that day was First Lieutenant Earl E. DeVore. The crew had flown together before, but was still gaining experience as a unit. Routine tasks preceded takeoff. Ground crews inspected engines and control surfaces. Armorers checked ammunition belts feeding into the turrets. Fuel levels were confirmed. The B-17, built for durability, carried multiple defensive positions, yet each mission revealed new vulnerabilities. Takeoff proceeded without incident. One by one, the bombers lifted from the runway and circled to form up. Over the channel, the formation stabilized at altitude. Inside the ball turret, Smith monitored his sector. The drone of 4 engines combined with the steady vibration of the airframe. Frost gathered at the edges of his field of vision where the Perspex dome met the cold air outside. As the formation approached the French coast, anti-aircraft fire began to register. Black bursts appeared ahead and slightly above, timed to intersect the bomber's path. Flak accuracy improved as the group neared Saint-Nazaire. Fragments from exploding shells tore through the airframe of several aircraft. Reports over the interphone described minor damage in different ships. The formation tightened to maintain mutual defensive coverage. Shortly before the bomb run, Smith's aircraft sustained a direct hit. A shell burst close to the fuselage, sending shrapnel through the radio compartment and igniting a fire. Smoke moved forward through the interior. The interphone crackled with urgent exchanges as crew members attempted to identify the source of the flames. The radio operator was wounded. The aircraft commander ordered fire extinguishers brought forward. Inside the ball turret, Smith could see little of the internal damage. His position limited him to external observation unless directed otherwise. When word came that the fire persisted, he prepared to leave the turret. Exiting required rotating the turret to a specific position, opening the hatch and pulling himself back into the fuselage. The procedure, usually performed on the ground or in calm flight, became more complicated under combat conditions. The B-17 continued toward the target despite the damage. Doctrine emphasized maintaining formation during the bomb run. Breaking away increased vulnerability. Smoke inside the aircraft thickened, reducing visibility and complicating breathing even with oxygen equipment in place. Crew coordination depended on brief, clear instructions. Smith emerged from the turret and moved toward the source of the fire. Flames had spread along insulation and damaged wiring. With portable extinguishers partially depleted, he and others attempted to smother remaining hotspots. The aircraft jolted as additional flak bursts struck nearby. One engine showed signs of malfunction, its instruments fluctuating. Despite the internal fire, the bombardier released the aircraft's bombs over Saint-Nazaire. The bomb bay doors closed. The formation began its turn away from the target area. German fighters, alerted by the approaching bombers, moved in during the withdrawal phase. Attacks often intensified after bomb release, when formations were adjusting course and defensive fire patterns shifted. Smith returned to his turret as enemy aircraft approached from below and to the rear. Tracers passed beneath the fuselage. He fired controlled bursts, tracking a fighter crossing his field of view. The vibration of the guns transmitted through the turret frame. Reports from other gunners indicated continued attacks from multiple directions. Inside the aircraft, conditions remained unstable. The earlier fire had been contained, but not entirely extinguished. Electrical systems showed intermittent failures. Communication lines cut in and out. The wounded radio operator required attention. Fuel consumption increased as the pilot adjusted throttle settings to compensate for engine irregularities. Over the channel, the formation thinned. Several bombers had fallen behind or diverted due to damage. The 100th Bombardment Group suffered notable losses that day. Crews watched for aircraft dropping from position, trailing smoke or losing altitude. Smith's B-17 struggled to maintain speed. The damaged engine forced the pilot to reduce power on one side. The aircraft drifted slightly lower than the main formation. In such positions, exposure to additional attacks increased. Defensive fire from neighboring bombers became less consistent as spacing widened. Within the fuselage, smoke reappeared. Residual embers had reignited insulation near the radio room. Extinguishers were nearly empty. Crew members improvised with whatever materials were available, attempting to prevent flames from reaching fuel lines or control cables. The possibility of structural failure was discussed briefly over the interphone before the pilot instructed all stations to focus on their assigned duties. Smith alternated between firing at distant fighters and assisting with internal damage control when called upon. Movement through the aircraft required balance and coordination, especially with the plane no longer flying smoothly. Oxygen masks fogged with breath and smoke. Hands numbed from cold and strain. As the English coastline came into view, the immediate threat from enemy fighters diminished. The aircraft, however, remained compromised. One engine operated at reduced efficiency. Electrical circuits controlling certain instruments functioned irregularly. The interphone failed intermittently, forcing crew members to shout instructions along the narrow fuselage. Approach procedures required careful planning. Landing a damaged heavy bomber posed risks to both crew and ground personnel. The pilot communicated with Thorpe Abbotts, reporting fire damage and wounded crew. Emergency vehicles positioned themselves near the runway. The B-17 touched down heavily but remained intact. Ground crews quickly surrounded the aircraft, extinguishing lingering smoke and assisting the injured. Smith exited last from his position, stepping onto the tarmac after several hours in the air. The aircraft bore visible scars, holes through the fuselage, blackened sections near the radio compartment, and damaged engine cowling. Initial debriefings focused on the mission outcome and damage assessment. Maintenance officers examined the airframe to determine repair feasibility. Intelligence personnel gathered observations about flak concentrations and fighter tactics. Casualty reports from the group reflected the severity of the engagement over Saint-Nazaire. For Smith and his crew, the day concluded with routine medical checks and written statements. At that point, no extraordinary designation had been attached to the events of May 1st. The mission had followed the established pattern of risk and endurance characteristic of daylight bombing operations in 1943. The operational tempo allowed little time for extended reflection. Replacement aircraft and crews arrived regularly. Missions were scheduled based on weather and intelligence updates. The 100th Bombardment Group prepared for subsequent sorties within days. In the weeks that followed, the cumulative strain on both men and machines became increasingly apparent. Aircraft that returned from combat bore layered repairs. Crews measured their experience not in months, but in the number of missions completed. Survival often depended on variables outside individual control: weather shifts, mechanical reliability, flak timing, and the presence or absence of escort fighters. For Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, the events over Saint-Nazaire represented one of many engagements during a period when attrition rates remained high. The official recognition of specific actions would come later. At the time, the immediate concerns centered on aircraft readiness, crew health, and preparation for the next assigned target. The routine resumed with little outward acknowledgement of what had narrowly been avoided. In the days following the Saint-Nazaire mission of May 1, 1943, the 100th Bombardment Group resumed operations under the same directives that governed the 8th Air Force. Weather windows dictated departure times. Targets were selected to disrupt submarine production, aircraft assembly, and rail distribution networks across occupied Europe. Losses from recent missions were recorded, replacement crews integrated, and damaged aircraft evaluated for repair or salvage. At Thorpe Abbotts, ground crews worked steadily on the B-17 flown by Lieutenant DeVore's crew. Inspection revealed extensive internal damage. Shrapnel had severed wiring bundles, punctured oxygen lines, and compromised structural members near the radio compartment. Soot marked the fuselage interior where insulation had burned. Maintenance officers noted that the fire had come dangerously close to critical control cables running along the aircraft's spine. Repairs were ordered, though completion would require time and scarce replacement parts. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith returned to regular duties while the aircraft remained grounded. He attended gunnery briefings and participated in formation drills conducted on the perimeter track. Such intervals between missions were brief. Crews rotated through available aircraft, often flying with different combinations of personnel due to illness, injury, or reassignment. Reports from the Saint-Nazaire raid circulated informally among squadron members. Accounts of the internal fire, the wounded radio operator, and the aircraft's damaged engine became known across the group. Formal evaluation of individual actions moved through administrative channels at a measured pace. Statements were reviewed by squadron commanders, then forwarded through group headquarters. Meanwhile, operational pressure increased. German air defenses adapted to the sustained daylight offensive. Flak batteries along the French coast recalibrated their timing. Fighter units refined interception patterns, often attacking in coordinated waves. The 8th Air Force continued to emphasize tight formation flying, concentrating defensive firepower to deter attackers. On subsequent missions in May and June, the 100th Bombardment Group encountered heavy resistance. Crews observed that bomb runs over industrial regions in northern France and western Germany were increasingly contested. Ball turret gunners, positioned low and exposed, faced attacks from beneath where fighter pilots sought blind spots between overlapping fields of fire. Smith resumed flight status with a repaired aircraft. The memory of smoke filling the fuselage remained recent, but operational demands allowed little space for extended reflection. On takeoff and climb-out, attention centered on routine checks, oxygen flow, ammunition feed alignment, turret rotation. The narrow confines of the ball turret required complete focus on assigned sector responsibilities. During a late May mission toward the Ruhr Valley, the group encountered sustained fighter opposition after bomb release. Several aircraft were forced out of formation by engine damage. Smith's crew maintained position, though flak bursts again bracketed the formation. Reports of aircraft failing to return became familiar entries in after-action summaries. The cumulative effect of repeated missions began to alter crew dynamics. Conversations in the mess hall reflected practical concerns, mechanical reliability, flak accuracy, escort range, rather than overt expressions of fear. Official briefings continued to present operational objectives in strategic terms. Industrial output statistics and reconnaissance photographs were displayed to demonstrate progress. At crew level, success was measured by aircraft that returned intact. Within this environment, the account of the May 1st fire underwent formal review. Squadron leadership documented Smith's movement from the ball turret into a smoke-filled compartment while under attack. Statements from fellow crew members described his efforts to control flames after extinguishers were exhausted. These reports advanced through the group chain of command. Administrative processes in a combat zone operated deliberately. Recommendations for awards required corroboration and evaluation at multiple levels. Officers considered the distinction between actions expected as part of duty and those exceeding normal requirements. The criteria for the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, were stringent and rarely applied to aerial gunners at that stage of the air campaign. While paperwork moved through headquarters channels, missions continued. In mid-June 1943, the 100th Bombardment Group participated in a raid against Bremen. German fighter response proved concentrated. Several aircraft from the group were shot down. Surviving crews described prolonged attacks that exploited gaps forming as damaged bombers drifted out of position. Smith's aircraft sustained minor flak damage on that sortie, but returned safely. The pattern of attrition across the 8th Air Force, however, raised concerns among senior commanders. Without consistent long-range fighter escort, bomber formations remained vulnerable beyond the reach of existing Allied fighters. Doctrine emphasized mutual support and rigid adherence to formation structure, yet mechanical failures and battle damage frequently disrupted these patterns. For enlisted men such as Smith, the gap between official doctrine and in-flight reality became increasingly apparent. Training manuals described coordinated defensive fire zones and prescribed responses to fire and structural damage. In practice, smoke, shock waves, and wounded crew members complicated ideal procedures. Decision-making often relied on immediate assessment rather than strict adherence to written guidance. During debriefings, crews recounted instances where internal fires had nearly severed control lines or where oxygen systems failed at altitude. Maintenance reports documented recurring electrical malfunctions after flak strikes. Each mission added to a body of experience that extended beyond formal instruction. By late June, news arrived at Thorpe Abbotts that Smith's actions on May 1st had been elevated for higher consideration. The group commander informed the crew that recommendations were moving beyond the group level. Specific details were not widely circulated, but it became understood that the evaluation exceeded standard commendation categories. Operational tempo did not slow in response. In early July, missions targeted industrial sites deeper inside Germany. Weather forecasts often forced last-minute changes in target selection. Crews prepared for extended flight durations, carrying additional fuel where feasible. The physical strain of high-altitude operations accumulated, with frostbite and oxygen deprivation remaining persistent hazards. On July 6, 1943, Smith and his crew participated in a mission to Kassel. Heavy flak over the target area damaged multiple aircraft. The 100th Bombardment Group suffered losses that day, reinforcing its emerging reputation as a unit frequently exposed to intense opposition. Survivors described the sky as filled with smoke bursts and fragments, with formation cohesion difficult to maintain. The aircraft Smith occupied returned with visible damage, but without serious injury to crew members. Maintenance personnel again assessed repair timelines. Replacement parts were drawn from limited stocks. The wear on airframes from repeated combat exposure became evident across the base. Within weeks of the Saint-Nazaire mission, confirmation arrived that Smith would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on May 1st. The citation emphasized his persistence in combating the fire and defending the aircraft, despite wounds and hazardous conditions. The announcement circulated through official channels before being communicated directly to the crew. Recognition carried administrative implications. Arrangements were made for Smith to travel to the United States to receive the decoration. The decision reflected both the significance of the award and the desire to publicize acts of valor to maintain morale on the home front. For the 100th Bombardment Group, the selection of one of its enlisted men for the nation's highest military honor drew attention to the unit's operational record. Yet the timing introduced complications. Removing an experienced gunner from a crew already operating under strain required reassignment. Replacement personnel, though trained, lacked shared mission experience with DeVore's team. The group continued to absorb losses and integrate new arrivals into established formations. Smith completed several additional missions before departure. Each sortie followed the familiar cycle: briefing, takeoff, formation assembly, target approach, defensive engagement, and return. The award process did not alter operational exposure. German defenses remained consistent. Aircraft damage reports continued to accumulate. In late summer 1943, Smith departed England for the United States to receive the Medal of Honor from the President. The ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., conducted according to established military protocol. His citation described the May 1st mission in measured terms, noting his disregard for personal safety while extinguishing flames and defending the aircraft. Following the award presentation, Smith was assigned to stateside duties, participating in war bond drives and training activities. The Army Air Forces often rotated decorated personnel into such roles to support recruitment and morale efforts. While this removed him from immediate combat exposure, it also separated him from the operational environment that had defined his service in England. Back at Thorpe Abbotts, the 100th Bombardment Group continued its missions. Losses mounted during late 1943, particularly in deep penetration raids without sufficient escort. The group's casualty rate reinforced its developing reputation among 8th Air Force units. Crews understood that survival across a full tour of missions remained uncertain. The contrast between official commendation and the ongoing attrition within the group underscored a broader tension. Individual recognition highlighted acts of courage, yet systemic vulnerabilities persisted. Mechanical limitations, escort range constraints, and concentrated enemy defenses shaped each sortie regardless of past decorations. For Smith, transition to training and public appearances marked a shift in daily routine. His experience over Saint-Nazaire became part of official narratives emphasizing resilience and determination. At the same time, his former crew continued to fly missions over heavily defended targets facing conditions similar to those encountered on May 1st. By autumn 1943, the air campaign entered another phase, with increasing emphasis on industrial targets deeper within Germany. The arrival of longer-range escort fighters began to alter engagement patterns gradually, though this shift was not immediate. Attrition rates remained high through the year's end. The story of Maynard Smith's survival and recognition unfolded against this evolving backdrop. His award acknowledged actions taken under extreme conditions, yet it did not remove the structural risks inherent in daylight bombing doctrine at that time. Operational reports continued to document fires, engine failures, and aircraft lost to flak and fighters. For many crews, survival depended on circumstances beyond deliberate control. Smith's removal from active combat duty placed him outside that cycle, but the environment that had shaped his actions remained unchanged for those still flying. By early 1944, the strategic air campaign over Europe had entered a transitional phase. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, began to extend protective coverage deep into German airspace. While this development reduced bomber losses over time, the transition was gradual. Throughout the winter of 1943-1944, heavy bomber groups continued to face concentrated opposition over key industrial targets. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, after completing his Medal of Honor tour in the United States, remained assigned to stateside duties for several months. His responsibilities included appearances at war bond rallies, training demonstrations at gunnery schools, and instructional briefings for newly assigned airmen. Official accounts of the Saint-Nazaire mission were used to illustrate discipline under pressure and adherence to duty. Despite the recognition, Smith's position within the Army Air Forces remained that of an enlisted gunner. The decoration did not automatically alter rank structure or occupational assignment. Instructors at training facilities valued his combat experience, particularly in discussing internal aircraft emergencies such as onboard fires and structural damage from flak bursts. His presentations were factual, focusing on procedure rather than personal narrative. By mid-1944, as Allied forces prepared for sustained operations on the continent following the Normandy landings, the Army Air Forces faced persistent demands for experienced personnel. Casualties and crew rotations continued across multiple theaters. The question of returning decorated airmen to operational status was considered on a case-by-case basis. Smith requested reassignment to combat duty. Such requests were not uncommon among decorated servicemen who preferred active roles to ceremonial obligations. Administrative channels reviewed his record and current personnel requirements. Ultimately, approval was granted for his return to operational service, though not to his former unit in England. He was assigned to a B-17 unit operating in the Pacific Theater. By late 1944, American heavy bomber operations in the Pacific had expanded significantly. Targets included Japanese-held installations in the Philippines and Formosa, as well as shipping lanes supporting Japanese logistics. Operational conditions differed from those in Europe. Long overwater flights required additional fuel planning. Weather patterns in the Pacific presented distinct challenges, including tropical storms and unpredictable cloud formations. Smith joined his new crew as a gunner with prior combat experience and the nation's highest decoration. Within the unit, this distinction carried both respect and practical expectations. His familiarity with internal aircraft emergencies and defensive engagement was regarded as an asset. However, the Pacific environment introduced unfamiliar variables, including extended exposure over open sea and limited diversion options in case of mechanical failure. On missions departing from bases in the Mariana Islands, B-17 crews faced long transit periods before reaching target areas. Japanese fighter opposition, though reduced compared to earlier stages of the war, remained present in certain sectors. Anti-aircraft defenses around fortified positions continued to present hazards similar in principle to those encountered over Europe. During one mission in early 1945 targeting airfields in the Philippines, Smith's aircraft encountered mechanical irregularities shortly after bomb release. Oil pressure in one engine fluctuated, and the pilot reduced power to prevent seizure. The aircraft fell slightly behind formation. While escort coverage was available, separation increased vulnerability during withdrawal. Smith maintained his assigned turret position, scanning for approaching fighters. Over interphone, the crew discussed fuel margins and potential diversion airstrips. The nearest friendly field required a course adjustment that would carry the aircraft over open water for an extended distance. The damaged engine continued to operate at reduced output. Midway through the return flight, smoke appeared near the affected engine nacelle. Unlike the internal fire over Saint-Nazaire, this indication originated externally. The flight engineer reported rising temperature readings. The pilot considered feathering the propeller to reduce drag, but complete shutdown would compromise altitude maintenance over water. Standard procedure dictated cautious assessment before drastic measures. Smith, recalling prior experience with onboard fire, listened as the engineer attempted corrective adjustments. The smoke fluctuated rather than intensifying, suggesting partial oil leakage rather than combustion. The crew monitored instruments while maintaining altitude sufficient to allow gliding distance toward potential emergency landing areas. As the aircraft neared friendly territory, engine performance stabilized. The pilot opted to maintain reduced power rather than risk asymmetric drag from full shutdown. The B-17 reached base without further escalation. Post-flight inspection confirmed oil system damage caused by fragment impact from light anti-aircraft fire over the target area. Such incidents underscored the persistence of mechanical vulnerability, even as strategic momentum shifted in favor of Allied forces. The Pacific assignment introduced different stress patterns. Overwater navigation required precise coordination with radio beacons and celestial fixes when available. In-cloud flying over tropical systems occasionally disrupted formation integrity. On another mission later that spring, Smith's crew encountered heavy cloud cover over the objective. Bombing through overcast required reliance on radar equipment and led aircraft guidance. Formation spacing tightened as visibility decreased. In these conditions, maintaining defensive vigilance demanded heightened concentration. The absence of visual horizon references occasionally induced spatial disorientation among less experienced crew members. Smith's prior exposure to smoke-filled interiors and turbulent withdrawal phases provided a measure of steadiness. He adhered strictly to assigned sectors, conserving ammunition and reporting observed movement concisely. His conduct did not depart from established gunnery doctrine. Rather, it reflected accumulated familiarity with stress conditions common to aerial combat. By mid-1945, Japanese defensive capacity diminished significantly. Airfields previously contested were rendered inoperative. Allied bomber formations operated with increasing confidence, though risk never disappeared entirely. Mechanical failures, weather, and navigational error continued to account for aircraft losses. Within his Pacific unit, Smith was regarded less as a decorated symbol and more as an experienced non-commissioned officer. The daily routine of maintenance briefings, pre-flight checks, and debriefings reasserted itself as primary structure. Official references to his Medal of Honor were infrequent in operational settings. Mission performance and crew reliability defined standing within the squadron. In August 1945, following atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the subsequent Japanese surrender, combat operations ceased. Aircraft were gradually withdrawn or reassigned to transport duties. Personnel demobilization plans were drafted according to service duration and theater requirements. Smith's return to the United States marked the end of his wartime flight operations. His record included combat service in both the European and Pacific theaters, distinguished by survival through incidents that might easily have resulted in loss of aircraft or crew. The Medal of Honor citation remained formally associated with a single mission in May 1943, yet his subsequent service reflected continued exposure to operational risk. The unofficial decision to seek return to combat after public recognition had carried personal implications. It removed him from relative safety and training assignments and placed him once more in active operational environments. This choice did not alter strategic outcomes or official doctrine. It reflected a preference for duty consistent with his prior role, rather than extended ceremonial presence. As demobilization proceeded, Smith transitioned into civilian life along with thousands of other returning airmen. The broader narrative of the air war focused increasingly on strategic bombing results and technological developments. Individual accounts, even those recognized at the highest level, receded into institutional records. By late 1945, the immediate pressures of wartime operations had given way to administrative reorganization. Decorations were archived, personnel files finalized, and units deactivated or reassigned. For Smith, the turning point of his service, combating fire inside a damaged bomber, remained documented in official citation language. Yet the subsequent return to combat in another theater demonstrated that recognition had not insulated him from continued exposure. The war's conclusion provided resolution at a global scale. For individual airmen, it marked the cessation of routine risk rather than the erasure of accumulated experience. Smith's career illustrated the intersection between individual action and broader operational systems that remained imperfect even as victory approached. By the time Maynard Smith returned to civilian life in late 1945, the structure that had governed his wartime experience was already beginning to change. The United States Army Air Forces moved rapidly toward peacetime reduction. Units were deactivated, personnel discharged, and aircraft either scrapped, transferred, or placed into storage. The institutional urgency that had defined 1943 and 1944 gave way to administrative reassessment. Smith separated from active duty with the rank of Staff Sergeant. Like many enlisted airmen, he did not transition into a long-term military career. His Medal of Honor placed him within a small and highly visible group of decorated servicemen, but the distinction did not alter the practical realities of post-war adjustment. Employment, family responsibilities, and reintegration into civilian communities defined the next phase of life. In the immediate post-war years, public attention to decorated veterans remained strong. War bond tours had familiarized many Americans with the names and faces of Medal of Honor recipients. Smith occasionally participated in commemorative events and veterans gatherings. His citation was read aloud at formal ceremonies. The language remained consistent with the official version issued in 1943, emphasizing his actions in extinguishing fire and defending his aircraft despite injury. Within military circles, however, discussion of aerial doctrine shifted toward technological development. Jet propulsion, radar refinement, and nuclear capability dominated strategic planning. The daylight bombing experience over Europe was analyzed in terms of escort range, formation tactics, and industrial impact. Individual accounts were preserved in archives but no longer central to operational planning. For Smith personally, the consequences of his wartime exposure became more apparent over time. High-altitude service had subjected aircrew to repeated cycles of hypoxia risk, vibration, and extreme cold. Ball turret gunners in particular endured cramped positions for extended durations. Although such conditions were common among heavy bomber crews, long-term physical strain varied by individual. Medical documentation from the immediate post-war period reflected routine examinations rather than dramatic injury reports. His wounds from the Saint-Nazaire mission had been treated during the war and did not require extended hospitalization. Nevertheless, the cumulative effects of combat stress and physical confinement remained part of his lived experience. As years passed, public narratives of the Second World War increasingly emphasized large-scale campaigns. Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, island hopping in the Pacific. The role of enlisted aircrew members, particularly gunners, received comparatively limited attention outside specialized histories. Within the 8th Air Force veteran community, however, recognition of hazardous attrition rates persisted. The 100th Bombardment Group, with which Smith had flown in Europe, developed a lasting reputation for heavy losses during 1943. Reunions held in the 1950s and 1960s brought together surviving members. Accounts of missions such as Saint-Nazaire and Bremen were exchanged in measured tones. Emphasis rested less on heroism than on survival amid structural vulnerability. At these gatherings, Smith's presence carried dual significance. He was both a former crewman and a nationally recognized recipient of the Medal of Honor. Fellow veterans often referenced the May 1st mission, though he rarely expanded beyond established details. The official citation remained the primary record of his actions. Personal elaboration was limited, consistent with the restrained communication style common among many veterans of that generation. Institutionally, the Medal of Honor required periodic administrative review for archival accuracy. Biographical summaries were updated to reflect post-war occupation and residence. Invitations to military academies and training commands occasionally followed, where recipients were introduced to new generations of servicemen. Smith's presentations, when delivered, centered on discipline and procedural adherence rather than dramatic recounting. The broader stakes of his wartime actions became clearer when placed against statistical analysis of bomber survivability in 1943. Casualty rates among heavy bomber crews during that year were significant. Completion of a standard tour of missions was far from assured. In that context, the survival of a severely damaged aircraft over Saint-Nazaire represented a convergence of individual action and structural resilience. Yet it remained one instance within a larger pattern of vulnerability. In later decades, historians examining the European air campaign noted the technical limitations that had shaped early missions. Insufficient escort range, evolving German fighter tactics, and concentrated flak corridors contributed to high loss rates. The doctrine of maintaining formation under fire, though strategically sound in theory, often required individual improvisation when aircraft sustained internal damage. Smith's response to onboard fire illustrated such improvisation within doctrinal boundaries. As recognition of psychological stress among combat veterans expanded in the late 20th century, scholars revisited accounts of bomber crew experiences. Confinement within defensive turrets, exposure to extreme altitude conditions, and repeated confrontation with aircraft loss constituted a distinct operational strain. Smith's experience fit within this broader analytical framework, though his personal record remained primarily associated with the Medal of Honor action. In public memory, the phrase "luckiest man" occasionally surfaced in reference to individuals who survived circumstances that claimed many others. Applied retrospectively to Smith, the description reflected not institutional labeling, but interpretive commentary. Survival of the Saint-Nazaire mission, return to combat in the Pacific, and immobilization without fatal injury distinguished him from numerous contemporaries who did not complete similar trajectories. Yet the concept of luck in wartime context remained complex. Mechanical tolerances, flak timing, aircraft spacing, and immediate crew coordination each influenced outcome. Smith's actions contributed materially to the containment of fire and maintenance of defensive posture. At the same time, survival depended on factors beyond individual control: the structural durability of the B-17, the distribution of shrapnel fragments, and the aircraft's ability to remain airborne despite engine damage. Within veteran communities, such distinctions were understood without extensive articulation. Discussions emphasized shared experience rather than singular elevation. The Medal of Honor did not isolate Smith from this collective identity. Instead, it served as a formal acknowledgement layered atop a common operational background. As decades passed, archival preservation of Second World War records improved access to mission reports and crew statements. Researchers examining the May 1, 1943 mission identified corroborating documentation supporting the citation narrative. Technical assessments confirmed the proximity of fire to control systems and the extent of structural damage sustained. These findings reinforced the factual basis of official recognition. The stakes of his earlier decision to return to combat after stateside assignment became clearer in retrospective analysis. Decorated personnel were often encouraged to remain in instructional or promotional roles. By requesting operational reassignment, Smith accepted renewed exposure at a time when experienced gunners were in demand. That decision did not attract institutional criticism. Rather, it aligned with manpower requirements. Nonetheless, it represented a personal assumption of continued risk. In the post-war era, as Cold War strategic planning reoriented air power toward deterrence, The lived experiences of piston-engine bomber crews receded from primary discourse. Commemorative histories and museum exhibits gradually incorporated their accounts. Smith's story appeared in such contexts, generally summarized in formal language drawn from the original citation. Through these institutional processes, the peak stakes of his wartime experience, fire within a heavily damaged aircraft over hostile territory, were preserved in documentation rather than dramatized retelling. The tension between doctrine and reality that characterized early daylight bombing remained an analytical theme within military scholarship. Smith lived quietly in the decades that followed, participating periodically in veterans' events but not seeking sustained public attention. His identity as a Medal of Honor recipient accompanied him, yet it did not define the entirety of his post-war life. Employment, family, and community involvement constituted the greater portion of his years. By the late 20th century, the generation that had served in heavy bomber crews diminished in number. Reunion attendance declined. Institutional memory relied increasingly on recorded archives and museum collections. Smith's actions over Saint-Nazaire remained part of that preserved record, cited in histories of the 8th Air Force and in compilations of Medal of Honor recipients. The broader consequences of his wartime service did not alter geopolitical outcomes. They did, however, illustrate the interplay between individual initiative and structural vulnerability within a specific operational framework. His experience bridged two theaters of war and reflected the evolving demands placed on aircrew between 1943 and 1945. As the decades closed, his name continued to appear in official rolls of honor, linked permanently to a mission over the French coast in May 1943. The institutional system that had once evaluated, awarded, and redeployed him had long since transformed. What remained were documented facts, preserved citations, and the quiet acknowledgement among historians and veterans that survival under such conditions was never guaranteed. Maynard's Snuffy Smith lived the remainder of his life largely outside the public spotlight that had briefly surrounded him in 1943. After the war, he settled into civilian employment, working in the private sector and raising a family. Like many former enlisted airmen, he did not build his identity around wartime recognition. The Medal of Honor, though the nation's highest military decoration, occupied a formal place in records and ceremonies rather than in daily routine. Over time, his wartime unit, the 100th Bombardment Group, became the subject of increasing historical study. The group's heavy losses during 1943, particularly in unescorted deep penetration raids, drew attention from military historians examining the evolution of Allied air strategy. Within those studies, the Saint-Nazaire mission of May 1, 1943, appeared as one example of the vulnerability of bomber formations before long-range escort became widely available. Smith's Medal of Honor citation remained consistent across official publications. It described how, after his B-17 was hit by flak and set ablaze, he worked to extinguish the fire, administered first aid, manned defensive guns, and remained at his post despite wounds and the risk of explosion. The language was formal and restrained, reflecting the standards of wartime documentation. In the decades following the war, the United States military refined its processes for preserving personal service records. Smith's file, including mission reports and award recommendations, became part of the permanent archival record. Researchers reviewing these documents found corroborating statements from crew members and maintenance personnel confirming the severity of the aircraft's damage. The proximity of the fire to control cables and oxygen systems reinforced the assessment that the aircraft's survival had been uncertain. As public interest in the Second World War fluctuated across generations, recognition of individual recipients of the Medal of Honor was periodically renewed. Anniversaries of major campaigns prompted renewed coverage of associated figures. Smith participated occasionally in commemorative events, though accounts suggest he rarely expanded upon the official narrative. His demeanor in public appearances remained measured, consistent with the restrained tone common among many veterans of his era. The phrase, "the luckiest man of what I won," would later be applied informally by commentators reflecting on his survival across two combat theaters. It referred not only to the Saint-Nazaire mission, but also to his subsequent return to active operations in the Pacific and his eventual demobilization without fatal injury. Yet such a description simplifies a complex reality. Survival in aerial warfare depended on numerous variables: aircraft construction, enemy aim, mechanical tolerances, weather, and coordinated crew response. Smith's experience illustrates how individual action operated within these structural conditions. His efforts to combat fire inside the B-17 were decisive in that moment, yet they occurred within a broader system characterized by high attrition. Many crews faced comparable emergencies without comparable outcomes. The difference between aircraft returning safely and those lost often rested on narrow margins. The institutional response to his actions followed established procedure. Recommendation, verification, and presidential approval resulted in award of the Medal of Honor. After presentation, the Army Air Forces reassigned him to stateside duties before eventually permitting his return to combat. This sequence reflected both the need to sustain morale through public recognition and the continuing demand for experienced aircrew. In the Pacific Theater, Smith's service proceeded without additional decoration of similar magnitude. He completed missions under different environmental conditions, including long overwater flights and tropical weather systems. Mechanical irregularities and combat exposure persisted, though Japanese defensive capacity diminished as the war progressed. His return from that theater in 1945 marked the conclusion of active flight operations. In later life, Smith's wartime story entered educational and museum contexts. Exhibits addressing the air war in Europe frequently included references to Medal of Honor recipients. The ball turret position, once a routine component of bomber crews, became an object of particular interest for visitors attempting to understand the confined conditions endured by gunners. Smith's service provided a documented example of those realities. He died in 1984 and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave marker identifies him as a Medal of Honor recipient, situating his name among others recognized for conspicuous gallantry. The formal inscription represents the enduring institutional acknowledgement of his actions. In evaluating his legacy, historians emphasize context rather than myth. The early daylight bombing campaign over Europe exposed heavy bomber crews to concentrated flak and fighter opposition without consistent long-range escort. Attrition rates were significant. Within that framework, Smith's survival during the Saint-Nazaire mission stands as a documented instance in which rapid response to internal fire prevented likely aircraft loss. The concept of luck, often invoked in retrospective commentary, does not diminish the deliberate actions recorded in his citation, nor does it fully account for the structural vulnerabilities inherent in bomber operations at the time. His experience demonstrates how preparation, training, and immediate decision-making interacted with unpredictable external forces. Today, the archival record preserves mission logs, maintenance reports, and award citations associated with his service. Veterans organizations continue to reference his name during commemorative events related to the 8th Air Force. The broader narrative of the Second World War now encompasses extensive scholarship on air strategy, industrial mobilization, and technological advancement. Within that expansive field, Smith's story occupies a specific and documented place. He did not claim that his actions altered the course of the war. The evidence indicates that he fulfilled assigned duties under extreme conditions, responded to unforeseen hazards, and survived where many others did not. The institutional system recognized that conduct through the highest available decoration. Afterward, he resumed service and ultimately returned to civilian life without public self-promotion. In this sense, the designation luckiest reflects survival across circumstances that statistically proved lethal for many aircrew members. It coexists with the documented record of disciplined response under fire. The balance between those elements, chance and action, defines much of the lived experience of aerial warfare in 1943 and 1944. Maynard Smith's name remains inscribed in military archives, museum exhibits, and the cemetery at Arlington. His story illustrates the intersection of individual responsibility and systemic risk within the Allied air campaign. It endures not as myth or legend, but as a carefully recorded account of one airman's service within a vast and demanding conflict. If you value historically grounded W2 stories about individuals whose experiences shaped larger operations, consider subscribing to continue exploring documented accounts like this one.